Well, greetings. So for this part of the first class, we're going to go to you listening and watching rather than have to read. I imagine many of you have seen Les Mis, either the recent film or perhaps you've seen it on stage. And it starts quite dramatically after Jean Valjean is released from prison. In the movie, he's out there working with all those convicts. He's released, and we pick him up, and he comes into this bishop's home and is given a food and a place to stay. Quite grateful for this. But then he gets up before anyone else and takes some of the silver that he had spied the night before. And a few minutes later in the scene, he's brought back to the bishop's house by some police. And of course, they're bringing back because they're convinced that what he has been telling them isn't true, because he made up this story that the bishop had actually given him this silver. So they drag him in, and what happens? The bishop turns, grabs some candlesticks off the shelf, hands them to Jean, and says, "Oh, but you forgot these." And the police stop, look at him kind of dumbfounded, and say, "What's this?" And say, well, he was telling the truth. And of course, Jean himself is a bit perplexed, but he takes the candlesticks. The police release him, cut off the cords, his land, and they leave. And Jean is standing there with the bishop. And why did you do this? And so the bishop communicates to him this forgiveness, this unexpected grace, and then exhorts him to say, take these, go ahead, sell them, but make this a new start. Make this a different life for you ahead. So it was forgiveness that led to transformation. Now, from just seeing the movie or from watching it on stage, you might imagine that this is just a brief moment of extreme charity or forgiveness on the part of this bishop, that he just in this particular moment decides to do this amazing thing. Perhaps he had thought back to the Sermon on the Mount or something, thought a verse, and did this action. But in the novel by Victor Hugo, actually we would find out that this is not such a surprising action. Victor Hugo takes 50 pages in the novel to tell us about this bishop. And I won't recount all those 50 pages right now, but just a few things that we'd find in there. We'd find that this bishop, at one point earlier when he had been a priest, he was living in a very spacious residence right next to a hospital, and the hospital was overcrowded. He decided to switch, and he let the hospital use his residence and bring patients in there, and he went and lived in a small, tiny space in the hospital. In another scene, he convinced a gang of thieves to share with and make contributions to the poor. There's another time when another priest refused to go to prison to visit a murderer. This bishop went to prison and led the murderer into reconciliation with God. So for 50 pages, Victor Hugo recounts for us these kind of actions by this bishop. So what's the point? Why did he put those 50 pages in the novel telling these things? I think Hugo wanted to make clear that this dramatic action by the bishop to forgive Jean Valjean did not emerge from nowhere. This was consistent with a lifelong pattern, not a product of careful moral reflection. So, the bishop didn't have time to read essays, to think about, well, what does one do in a situation when you've been robbed and how do you respond? He didn't have time to do careful moral reasoning. He responded in the moment. The moment was all he had. He responded with this act of forgiveness. It reminds me of a quote from Dallas Willard that I'd like to read for you. It says, Jesus invited people to follow him into that sort of life from which behavior such as loving one's enemies will seem like the only sensible and happy thing to do. For a person living that life, the hard thing to do would be to hate the enemy, to turn the supplicant away. So I think Dallas Willard would say that the bishop's true companionship of Christ led him to do what came natural. It would have been hard for him to do any other. It had become the pattern of his life. So ethics, as we've been seeing in this section, is not so much just about having right information, but it's about being shaped into making right decisions by patterns, habits that are developed. So I'd like to give another example of this from related to jail as well. So each week I go to the Fresno County Jail and lead a Bible study. And a common thing that inmates will say to me is they'll say something like, "Oh, I slipped up this week." Or they might ask a question of, "Why? I'm trying so hard, but I'm not getting better in the way that I would like." So, I reply in different ways, different times, but three common things I say. First of all, I try to take a step back with them and say, but let's look at what's going on here. Look at what you're doing. You're saying to me, "Oh, I slipped up." But even the fact that you're saying that you're saying, "Oh, I wish I was different," that in itself is evidence of the Spirit working in your life. I say, "You wouldn't have said that a few months ago, would you?" And they say, "No." Then the other thing I say is, it only makes sense that you're in this situation and someone did something and you lashed out. Because you've had years of acting that way. You have been trained by the law of the street, which is lash back, get revenge. Don't let someone else take advantage of you. You have done that and it's become automatic for you. It's been so automatic that it's going to take a while. It's going to take time to, in a sense, become reprogrammed. But then I say, but each time that you do a kind act, each time that you turn away rather than seeking revenge, each time you express forgiveness, each time you resist that temptation, it is becoming a more and more normal, natural thing for you to do. That's what the bishop had been doing for years, and it had become natural habit. It was an ethic of character. His virtue flowed from that situation. So returning to the quote we had earlier from Ben Mitchell, quote, "The life of wisdom is not so much about rules as inhabiting a way of life." The bishop was not just following a rule. He was something flowing from his life. Continue with Mitchell, "of living with certain sets of values, occupying a kind of character." The bishop was occupying that character. So, a correct list of behaviors and reliance on automatic living out of those behaviors is not enough. Rather, Christian ethical action is formed by a long succession of choices that become habit forming, and development of virtues and wisdom that will lead to not just making correct ethical choices, but also living them out. I invite you to continue reading the lecture.